Welcome once again to the Brownstone, Wolfe's sanctuary of logic, orchids, and murder. Do tell us where in the world you're listening from, and don't hesitate to share your thoughts. If you enjoy these cases, consider liking and subscribing. Now then, shall we begin? Nero Wolfe and Archie's early return. Right now, over 85% of the people watching aren't subscribed. If you've been enjoying these Nero Wolfe stories, hitting that subscribe button is the best way to be sure you never miss the next mystery. Your support helps keep these stories alive and lets us keep bringing them to you. February 1951 made Manhattan smell of coal and wet wool. I reached the Brownstone 2 days early, hat dripping and patience thin. A Western Union boy waited on the stoop, stamping warmth into his shoes. He checked his slip, blinked, and decided I would do for Mr. Wolfe. The yellow envelope bore Wolfe's name in brave block capitals. I let myself in with my key. Our door keeps its dignity. The vestibule offered stock from the kitchen, orchids, and the city's soot. Fritz called a greeting and stayed where he belonged beyond the door. The office sat quiet under lamplight, blinds down against the damp. Wolfe's yellow leather looked patient, which was his chair's best trick. He would be among the orchids until 6, and that was scripture. I used the brass knife and opened the envelope cleanly. Claudia Armitage. Stop. Park Avenue. Stop. Request. Interview tonight. Regarding estate. Stop. Grave urgency. Stop. Retainer satisfactory. Stop. Please confirm by telephone before 7. Stop. The capitals pushed, but the tone remained cold and controlled. A timestamp at 9 told me when it began its journey. At the margin, someone had added a line that was careless. Before your assistant returns Friday. Stop. I held it to the lamp and read everything twice for comfort. Wednesday was my day, not Friday, thanks to a cancelled assignment. Whoever wrote that had a timetable set to someone else's watch. I drew the telephone close and asked for the Park Avenue number. A maid answered in the proper refined tone for a refined widow. I announced myself and asked for Claudia Armitage, businesslike and polite. The line clicked, then a voice arrived, crisp as new stationery. Mrs. Armitage, I said. Archie Goodwin for Mr. Wolfe. Mr. Goodwin, she said. Is Mr. Wolfe available for a conference tonight? He is available after dinner, I said. He might hear you at 8:30. If he will receive me, she said, I will bring relevant documents. What kind of documents, I asked, and how urgent is urgent? My late husband's estate requires immediate attention, she said. I prefer your house because it protects conversation and reputation. We try to keep both safe, I said. Tell me about retainer. 1,000 now. Cashier's check, she said, even and clear. Expenses to follow, as needed, subject to reasonable itemizing. The radiator gave one hiss, and my eyebrows made their travel. That will secure attention, I said. 8:30 will be acceptable. Please expect me alone, she said. I must avoid any notice tonight. We exchanged address and exchange, then ended with the usual courtesies. I placed the receiver back, and the office resumed its regard. The telegram waited on the blotter, the ink still looking recent. I wrote her particulars in the book, which spares quarrels later. Then I pressed the buzzer to the plant rooms, sins and all. The exchange name chimed like silver spoons, neat and expensive. I noted it because Wolfe prefers such shorthand when passing people. I checked the filing time again, since ink can flatter lies. 9 in the morning leaves hours for plans to breathe and wander. Someone believed those hours would pass with me elsewhere, comfortably absent. That pebble stayed in my shoe, however fine the leather. It is not done before 6, yet phone calls earn exceptions. Yes, Wolfe said, which is a conversation if you know him. Telegram, I said. Claudia Armitage, Park Avenue, urgent estate business tonight. Silence took a pause, then returned to work on my ears. The orchids keep me until 6, he said. Dinner holds me until 7. Afterward I might endure interruption, given compensation and sense. 1,000 at once by cheque, I said. Documents promised. Fui, he said, without vinegar, which meant he had consented. 8:30, I said. She wishes to avoid attention and arrives alone. Arrange the red chair nearest the door, he said. Align it exactly. Some people sit straighter when the room acknowledges straightness. And increase the heat. Damp encourages whining. Your campaign against whining enjoys my support, I said, and rang off. Fritz arrived at the threshold with a tray and that solemn gait. He placed a glass on the table and announced lamb for dinner. Rain argues for lamb with rosemary, and Fritz never loses that argument. I thanked him and kept my hands civilized around the beer. The blinds came down another fraction while I watched the street. A sedan waited opposite, hood steaming, driver half drowned in smoke. He wrote in a small book and counted traffic like an usher. He might have been waiting for anyone. I dislike that coincidence. I turned back to the telegram and the ridiculous margin line. Friday had been written as if I were a calendar decoration. My early return had cancelled somebody else's arithmetic. At 6, Wolfe came down the stairs, the plant rooms trailing warmth. He entered as if gravity preferred him, then made the chair agree. He drank and held out a hand, and I handed the paper. "The 1,000 is a door," he said. "It is not a hallway." "She will bring documents," I said. "She values discretion and speed." "People who value speed often detest accuracy," he said. He read again and tapped the margin with one forefinger. "She miscounted your days," he said, "or wished others to miscount them." "The boy delivered it to me on the stoop," I said. "That does not comfort me," he said. "Assumptions rarely do." "We will not credit that line until it earns the courtesy. Meanwhile, the room will be exact." He dictated the diary entry, brief and complete as he prefers. Name, address, time, and money, each accorded one tidy line. "Her voice," he said, "provide contour." "Educated," I said. "Grief taught it breath control." "Fear sits in the outer room, but it keeps its hat on." He grunted, which is a compliment that refuses to lower itself. "Examine the rug," he said, "and prepare the ashtrays." "The damp will not borrow recruits here tonight." I did as ordered, and the house made its small music. The radiator agreed to behave, and the blinds found true lines. 2 fresh pencils lay by the blotter, sharp but not hostile. At 7 the bell announced dinner with confidence that required no reply. We ate without talk because the lamb did all necessary talking. Coffee followed, and coherence returned like a friend with a coat. Wolfe moved back to his chair with that private inevitability. Outside, a bus sighed by with faces pressed to misted glass. The block listened the way moneyed blocks listen, carefully and close. Our routines joined that quiet, which suits a house that sells discretion. Upstairs, the orchids kept their steady secrets about time and temper. The lamps were islands on the desk, and the air was comfortable. I drew the forward red chair to its line and tested balance. The telegram rested under the paperweight like a clerk at closing. The sedan across the street had gone, or chosen discretion. Handkerchiefs stood ready because comfort is not a small influence. I checked the lock and set the chain, the habit that earns salary. Our door does not indulge casual entries. The house has opinions. 8:15 showed on the mantel clock, a time that flatters callers. Rain wrote slow strokes on the window, elegant as a stubborn tutor. Wolfe shut his eyes for a moment that was not sleep. "Your early return," he said, "injures someone's planning already." "I enjoy my talent for offence," I said. "Do not mistake luck for talent," he said. "We will test them." "I saw a driver making notes," I said, "across the way." "Your observation is recorded," he said, and allowed one dry noise. We waited as professionals wait, with patience made of routine. Waiting can be dull or surgical depending on what may arrive. The house arranged itself like a jury waiting for counsel. I considered polishing my shoes, then decided restraint would look truer. Wolfe allowed no clutter that didn't help a conversation breathe. The bell rang at 28 past, and I stood by the chain. Wolfe nodded once, which is as loud as his approvals come. I opened the inner door and let the rain give its statement. Footsteps approached with the confidence of heels that know parquet. A hat brim lifted in the glass to measure our hospitality. I slipped the chain and opened, and the city leaned into the vestibule. Behind me, the yellow leather prepared itself for a client and a price. I saw only a gloved hand on the button and a travelling drop. Her face would come in due form, after the introductions and gait. The telegram in my pocket kept her voice alive and demanding, and my early return had already bent someone else's page. The brass hands on the mantel clock had just touched 7 when the bell rang, not a second early or late. I crossed the office, checked the vestibule through the glass, and found a woman framed by the frosted panel. The overcoat was sable, the hat small enough to show dark hair swept back from a pale, composed face. Her eyes, clear, unhurried, took my measure before I opened the inner door. "Mrs. Claudia Armitage?" I asked. "Yes, Mr. Goodwin. Her voice was the kind that didn't need to raise itself. I stepped aside and she entered with the kind of economy that avoids wasted motion. A trace of February damp clung to the fur. The coal smoke from the street followed it in. I relieved her of the coat and hat, hung them in the foyer closet, and led her into the office. The lamps were already lit, making the reds in the client chairs look richer against the dark wood. Wolfe sat in the yellow leather, facing the desk like a magistrate with all day to consider a case. He inclined his head as I made the introduction, then indicated the nearer red chair with a forefinger. "Mrs. Armitage," he said. She seated herself without fuss, clasping a small black handbag in her lap. I took my chair to the side, notebook ready. "My husband, Henry Armitage, died last October," she began. "His will left the bulk of his estate to me, with several specific bequests. Among them, a parcel of waterfront property in Red Hook was to pass to my stepdaughter Eleanor. At least, that was my understanding until 2 weeks ago." Her hands remained steady on the bag, but her eyes stayed on Wolfe. "A codicil has appeared," she continued, "dated in September, bearing my husband's signature, transferring that property to a man named Gilbert Renwick. I have every reason to believe it is a forgery." Wolfe rested his fingertips together. "Reason?" "Because my husband detested Mr. Renwick," she said evenly. "He considered him unscrupulous in business and disreputable in private conduct. And because Henry never mentioned this codicil to me, though he discussed all other estate matters in detail." Wolfe made a low noise. "And your interest?" "The property is valuable. More importantly, if the codicil is allowed to stand, my stepdaughter will contest the will. That contest will not be confined to the courtroom. She knows things about the family, about me, that would be unpleasant in the newspapers. I want the codicil discredited before she has cause." I watched Wolfe's eyes narrow slightly, his version of a raised eyebrow. "You have the document?" "A notarized copy," she said. "The original is in Mr. Renwick's possession. He claims to be safeguarding it until probate." She opened the handbag and withdrew a folded sheet inside a legal-sized envelope. The paper was cream, the notary's seal impressed in the lower corner. She placed it on the desk without leaning forward. "And this," she said, removing a second envelope, "is a letter from Henry to me, dated a week before his death. It contains his signature, his real signature, for comparison." I rose, took both envelopes to Wolfe, and resumed my seat. He drew the copy out first, adjusting his glasses. The signature sprawled across the page, bold and deliberate. The notary's statement followed in a neat, upright hand. Wolfe studied the letter next. It was brief, a note about a charity dinner they had attended, signed in the same large, confident script. He compared them without comment, then set both on the blotter. "This letter," he said. "When did you receive it?" "The day after it was written," she replied. "And the codicil, when did you first see it?" Her eyes held his a fraction too long. "When Mr. Renwick's solicitor presented it to my attorney, 12 days ago." "Not before?" "No." She smoothed the edge of the bag with her thumb. "I told you, Henry never mentioned it." Wolfe's gaze lingered, then dropped to the papers. "You will leave these with me?" "Yes." He leaned back, settling into the leather. "Forgery is not presumed, it is proved. It will require access to the original codicil and to Mr. Renwick." "I can arrange a meeting," she said. "Arrange nothing," he said curtly. "Mr. Goodwin will call on him. You will remain apart from any inquiry until I advise otherwise." Her chin lifted a degree. "If you think I will be idle—" "I think," Wolfe interrupted, "that if you interfere, you may damage the result you desire. I am not inclined to accept employment only to have it sabotaged by the client." Silence held for a moment. Then she inclined her head. "Very well." "The fee," Wolfe said, "is $200 a day, plus expenses." "I am prepared to pay it." She reached into the handbag again and placed an envelope thick with bills on the desk. Wolfe made no move to touch it. I took it instead and counted without flourish. "Mr. Goodwin will give you a receipt," he said. She rose, smoothing her skirt, and met his eyes. "You will keep this confidential." "To the extent possible, but I will not sacrifice the case to secrecy." "I understand." She turned to me. "Mr. Goodwin, you'll see me out." In the vestibule, I helped her into the sable and set the hat just so. She fastened the coat at the throat, the fur framing her face like an old portrait. "Your employer is a difficult man," she said. I've heard that. I'll expect results. I opened the outer door. The damp air met us, carrying the faint tang of coal from a chimney nearby. A hired car waited at the curb. The driver stepped out to open the rear door. She offered me the faintest nod, then was gone. When I returned, Wolfe was still looking at the codicil copy, his mouth a straight line. "Well?" I asked. "She evaded," he said. "About what?" "The day she found the codicil," he said. "She spoke of when it was shown to her, not when she first knew of it." I sat, opened the notebook, and made the entry. Claudia Armitage, widow of Henry, alleges forgery of codicil transferring Red Hook property to Gilbert Renwick. Produces notarized copy of codicil. Letter from husband dated week before death. Fee agreed. Client evasive on timing of discovery. Wolfe pushed the papers toward me. "Secure them, and bring beer." I filed the documents, locked the drawer, and went to the kitchen. The aroma of Fritz's roast chicken drifted in, promising dinner within the hour. I poured the beer and brought it back. Wolfe took the glass, drank, and closed his eyes. "Phooey," he said softly, and let the glass rest on the arm of the chair. I knew that tone. The case had already begun. Under a dry February sky, I left the brownstone with Wolfe's instructions snug in my pocket, and a mental note to keep my own temper under wraps. Madison Avenue was a brisk corridor of tailored overcoats and purposeful heels, the sidewalks reflecting a pale winter sun off patches of frozen slush. Renwick's building was a 12-story limestone block with brass-trimmed doors and a doorman who took my name without asking questions. He waved me toward an elevator lined in walnut veneer, the kind that made you feel underdressed even if you weren't. The ride up was smooth and silent. I stepped out onto a carpeted hall where the air carried a faint hint of beeswax and older money. A discreet plaque read, "Gilbert Renwick, Development and Holdings." I opened the glass door into a reception area that was small, warm, and carefully lit. The kind of place where a handshake might be as binding as a contract. The receptionist, a brunette with steel-framed spectacles and a voice like polished marble, looked up from a ledger. "Mr. Goodwin?" she asked. "That's me." "Mr. Renwick is expecting you." She led me through to an inner office, and the change in air was immediate. The scent of expensive pipe tobacco lingered, sweet and woody, the sort you'd expect to find curling from a leather chair in a gentleman's club. Renwick stood behind a broad mahogany desk, his suit a shade between charcoal and midnight, his tie a discreet silk. The polish in his manner was matched by the gleam in his eyes, not warmth exactly, but an alertness honed by years of turning property into profit. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, extending a hand with deliberate pressure. "Do sit down." The chair opposite him was deep, the leather cool to the touch. I settled in, noting the desk's uncluttered surface. A blotter, a crystal ashtray, a pen stand, and a single-framed photograph. The photograph caught my attention. Renwick standing between two men, all three in evening dress, their smiles fixed in that way which suggests they had just closed something lucrative. I recognized Charles Duval, a banker whose name had come up in more than one headline about shrewd deals, and Peter Lanford, an attorney with a reputation for making inconvenient documents disappear. Renwick followed my gaze. "Old friends," he said, "though I wouldn't call them part of this matter." "That matter being the codicil to Henry Armitage's will," I said. He leaned back, folding his hands. "A legitimate document, signed and witnessed. Mrs. Armitage is understandably unsettled, but her sentiment does not alter its authenticity." "I'd like to see the original," I said. His brows lifted a fraction. "Impossible, I'm afraid. Pending probate, it remains in my custody, and the court will not look kindly on any suggestion of impropriety." "Some might say refusing inspection invites the suggestion," I said. "Some might," he allowed, "but they would be mistaken. I am under no obligation to satisfy private curiosity." I let the pause breathe, listening to the faint hum of the building's heating system. "Then perhaps the copy I've seen will suffice for now, though the ink on it is remarkably fresh for something signed months ago." Renwick's eyes held mine, unblinking. "Perhaps your eye for stationery is keener than mine. I assure you the document is precisely as it should be." The scent of pipe tobacco seemed stronger now, or perhaps it was the awareness that I was getting nothing more from him without a crowbar. He reached for the pen stand, adjusted it by a hair's breadth, and set his hands flat on the desk. "Mr. Goodwin, I must return to my work. Convey my regards to Mr. Wolfe and tell him the matter will be resolved in due course, by the court, not by your employer's methods. I rose, taking in the photograph once more. The smooth grain of the mahogany, the subtle shine on Renwick's cufflinks. "Pleasure meeting you," I said. He gave a short nod. "Likewise." The receptionist saw me out, her shoes silent on the thick carpet. Back on the street, the cold air cleared the tobacco from my head, but not the impression that Renwick's office had been arranged with the precision of a stage set, and that somewhere in the wings, Duval and Lanford were waiting for their cues. The bell rang at precisely 9:20, a single decisive peal that echoed down the hallway. I was at my desk in the office reviewing my notes from the Renwick visit when Fritz appeared in the doorway. He didn't say a word, just tilted his head toward the front, his expression that of a man bringing in an unexpected course at dinner. I rose and crossed to the door, expecting perhaps a messenger. Instead, when I pulled it open, Inspector Kramer stood on the stoop, his overcoat collar turned up against the cold, hat low over his brow, and a dusting of snow melting on the shoulders. The set of his jaw promised no small talk. "Goodwin," he said. "I need to see Wolfe. Now." I stepped back to let him in, shutting the door behind him. "You've picked a delicate time. He's digesting corned beef and probably plotting my murder for letting you in at all." "Save the quips," Kramer said, shrugging out of his coat. "This isn't a social call. Renwick's dead." That took a half-second to register. "Dead?" "Shot. In his study. Time of death about 8:15, less than an hour after you saw him." I led him into the office where Wolfe sat in the yellow chair, fingers steepled over his middle, eyes narrowed at the intrusion. The lamplight pooled across the desk, catching the brass edge of the blotter. The room was warm, but the weight in Kramer's voice brought a draught of its own. "Inspector," Wolfe said, "your visits are rarely welcome, but tonight they are especially so. What occasion precipitates this breach of my evening?" "Renwick's been murdered," Kramer repeated, standing squarely in front of the desk. "Shot once through the chest, and a neighbour swears he saw a woman matching Claudia's description leaving the building minutes before." Wolfe's brows lifted a fraction. "You mean Mrs. Armitage?" "That's right. I want to talk to her, tonight." "She is under my roof," Wolfe said evenly, "and she will remain so until counsel is present. You may leave your questions with me, but you will not question her here." Kramer's jaw worked. "Don't push me, Wolfe. I can get a warrant." "You may," Wolfe replied. "It will gain you nothing but the satisfaction of your own obstinacy. My obligation is to my client, and that includes protecting her from injudicious interrogation." I moved to the globe stand, poured a measure of rye into a glass and brought it to Wolfe, who ignored it. Kramer's eyes followed me, irritation flickering. "She was seen leaving Renwick's place right before the shot was heard," he said. "That's not supposition, it's a sworn statement." "From a neighbour who recognised a silhouette in winter gloom," Wolfe said. "Not precisely the cornerstone of conviction." "It's enough to make her a person of interest," Kramer shot back. "Where was she between 8 and 8:30? "In this house," Wolfe said, "in the front room with Mr. Goodwin. Archie?" I nodded. "She came in at 7:50, stayed until 8:15, then went upstairs to her room. Unless she's mastered by location, she couldn't have been on East 61st Street at 8:15. Kramer's gaze hardened. "You'll see what the medical examiner says about the time of death." "You will," Wolfe said. "And so will I. That time, Inspector, will prove decisive." For a moment, only the ticking of the wall clock intruded. Outside, a gust rattled the bare branches against the window pane. Kramer took a slow breath, retrieved his coat from the rack, and jammed his arms into it. "I'll be back," he said, "and if I find she lied about her movements—" "You will inform me," Wolfe finished. "Good evening, Inspector." Kramer left without another word. The door closed, Fritz's footsteps retreating toward the kitchen. Wolfe reached for the glass I'd set down, took a measured sip, and let out a faint sigh. "The exact time, Archie," he murmured, "is everything." I went to the desk, picked up my notebook, and sat. Wolfe's eyes had that distant focus I knew well, already arranging the pieces on the board. Somewhere between 8:15 and the bullet, the truth waited, and until we found it, the snow outside was warmer than what lay ahead. Under Wolfe's orders, I headed for Duval's club first. The place sat on the upper floor of a narrow building off Madison, the kind of address that didn't bother with signage because the right people already knew it. Inside, A haze of cigarette smoke curled under the pressed tin ceiling. Somewhere beyond the mahogany bar, a muted jazz trio worked through body and soul, the saxophone weaving low and lazy. Glasses clinked, waiters slid between tables with the soft shuffle of well-trained shoes, and the lighting kept every face 3 parts shadow. Duval was at a corner banquette, a silk hat on the seat beside him, his dinner jacket a little too perfect for coincidence. "Goodwin," he said, with the kind of smile that had no warmth behind it. "Wolfe sent you to pry, I take it?" "Pry's a harsh word," I said, sliding into the seat opposite. "Let's say, collect the facts while the trail's still warm." He waved a hand for the waiter. "Scotch for him." Turning back to me, he leaned in. "You've heard, I suppose, about Renwick." "I was there earlier," I said. "You were where?" "At a private dinner club, 6 of us. We didn't break until nearly 11. He smoothed his cuff. "That should be easy enough to confirm. I imagine you'll be checking." "I imagine," I said. "You knew about the codicil." "Renwick told me last week. He was in an expansive mood. I thought it odd. He'd never been generous for generosity's sake." "Odd enough to mention it to anyone else?" A glimmer of irritation crossed his face. "No, and I had no reason to wish him harm. His arrangements, codicil or no, didn't touch me." We let the waiter set down my drink. I took a sip. The scotch was decent. "Funny thing," I said. "Lanford says Renwick mentioned it months ago." Duval's brows rose. "Months? That's impossible. Either he misremembers or he's trying to embroider the truth." I filed the reaction. When the bill came, he signed it with a flourish, retrieved his hat, and walked me to the street door. The winter air felt sharper after the muffled heat inside. Lanford's apartment was uptown, in a respectable brick building with a uniformed doorman who gave me a look that said he didn't encourage uninvited visitors. Mrs. Lanford answered the door, a tall, poised woman in a navy house dress, eyes sharp behind gold-rimmed spectacles. She led me to the sitting room, where Lanford stood by the fireplace, pipe in hand. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, as though we'd met before and the pleasure was entirely his. "I gather you're here about poor Renwick." "That's right. Where were you last night between 8 and 9? "At home, with my wife," he said smoothly. "We'd just finished supper. I was reading in my study." Mrs. Lanford nodded once as if to certify the statement. "You knew about the codicil?" I asked. "Yes. Renwick mentioned it. Oh, back in September, I think. We were discussing some old ventures. He was proud of his planning." "That's months earlier than Duval says." A faint shrug. "Then Duval wasn't as close as he thought. Renwick trusted me with more than most." He tamped the bowl of his pipe, gaze sliding toward the window. "Claudia would know, of course. She and Renwick were once business partners." That one landed. Claudia had omitted that little nugget when she spoke to Wolfe. I kept my face still, only noting the crackle from the fire and the faint scent of cherry tobacco. "Business partners," I repeated. "Yes," he said mildly. "A brief arrangement years ago. She may not speak of it, but it was no secret to those who were around at the time." The room seemed warmer now. I thanked him, took my leave, and stepped back into the cold street, turning the fact over. Wolfe would want that piece on the board at once. The rain had slackened to a mist by the time the cab deposited Milton Greaves at the curb in front of the brownstone. The lamps along 35th Street glowed soft in the fog, throwing halos around themselves like ghostly wreaths. I'd been at the window in the office watching for him, because Wolfe had decreed that he didn't want the doorbell ringing twice before Fritz got there. I went down myself, sparing Fritz the trouble. The bell came once, a discreet chime, and I opened the door to a man in a dark overcoat buttoned to the throat, his hat brim damp with drizzle. Greaves was a trim figure, with a neat grey moustache and eyes the colour of tarnished silver. He carried a flat leather case under one arm, the kind you might mistake for a portable chess set. "Mr. Greaves?" I said. "Yes, good evening." His voice was low, precise, with the trace of a Cambridge finish. "Come in." I stepped back, taking his coat and hat once the door was shut. "Mr. Wolfe's expecting you." Upstairs, the office was warm with the glow from the desk lamp and the steady hiss of the radiator. Wolfe sat in the yellow chair, body settled deep, fingers resting on the arms like a man enthroned. The red leather client chair opposite was vacant, waiting for Greaves. On Wolfe's desk, under a blotter, lay the codicil copy and the letter from Claudia's late husband. "Mr. Greaves?" Wolfe said as I ushered him in. Be seated. You know why you're here. Greaves inclined his head. Your note mentioned an examination of handwriting. You've something for me to look at? I fetched the documents from the desk, setting them side by side on a clean pad. Greaves opened his case, producing a jeweller's loupe, a slim brass ruler, and a magnifier with a circular light built in. He arranged them like a surgeon laying out instruments. Wolfe gestured. Archie will remain to observe. Proceed as you require. Greaves didn't waste time. He lifted the codicil first, holding it under the magnifier's halo. The lamplight caught the faint texture of the paper. His eyes narrowed, the loupe came into play. He traced the signature slowly with his gaze, not his finger. Interesting, he murmured after a moment. Wolfe made no sound. I leaned on the edge of my desk, hands in pockets, watching Greaves's head tilt a fraction to the left. He set the codicil down, picked up the letter, and repeated the process. After a few minutes, he shifted both documents back and forth, measuring downstrokes and comparing curves with his brass ruler. The only noises in the room were the faint whir of the radiator and the occasional creak of Greaves's chair. Finally, he removed the loupe, folded his hands, and looked at Wolfe. I should like to state my findings precisely. Wolfe inclined his head a quarter inch. Do so. Greaves tapped the codicil. This signature, ostensibly by the same hand as the one on the letter, bears identical idiosyncrasies, down to micro-variations in the loop of the capital H and the terminal flick on the final N. I said, so he was consistent. Some people are. Greaves gave me a brief glance, almost polite. Consistent, Mr. Goodwin, is not the word I would choose. Identical in every measurable respect is improbable for any two genuine signatures, even executed within minutes of each other. The natural variation of hand ensures this. Wolfe's lids lowered, just enough to signal interest without committing to anything more strenuous. Your conclusion? I believe, Greaves said, that the codicil signature was traced directly from the signature on this letter. The alignment of distinctive points, the pressure marks at stroke changes, the proportional ratios, are exact. That occurs only when one signature is mechanically copied from the other, either by direct tracing or through a transfer method. The radiator hissed on, undisturbed by the pronouncement. I glanced at Wolfe. His expression didn't flicker, but his right index finger began a slow tap on the chair arm. What about ink? I asked. Greaves shook his head. Both are in fountain pen ink consistent with early this year. That proves nothing, as ink of that type remains common, but the pen pressure pattern on the codicil is slightly uneven in spots where the forger likely paused to adjust alignment. There are microscopic hesitations at curve junctions. Wolfe said, You are confident? I am prepared to testify to it in any court in this state. Silence held for a moment, the kind that settles when a decisive card has been played. Wolfe broke it. Thank you, Mr. Greaves. Archie will see to your fee. Greaves began packing his tools. Do you wish my written report? Not at this juncture. Oral suffices. Archie, Wolfe gestured toward the hall. I escorted Greaves out, his case tucked under his arm again. At the door, he gave me a courteous nod. Good evening, Mr. Goodwin. Yeah, you too. When I came back to the office, Wolfe was still in the yellow chair, eyes half closed, the codicil and letter now stacked neatly. Shall I ring Kramer? I asked. No. The single syllable carried enough mass to sink a ferry. I took my desk chair. You've got a forged codicil traced from a letter signed by Claudia's husband, and you don't think the homicide squad would be interested. I'm not yet prepared to give Mr. Kramer another morsel to misapprehend. Wolfe's gaze opened, level on me. The fact of tracing is instructive, but it is not complete. The inference I require is contingent upon the manner in which the forger obtained both documents. Until I'm certain of that, I will not risk spoiling the skein with premature disclosure. I leaned back. So we sit on it. We do not sit, Archie. We proceed. That was Wolfe for you. Sitting was what his legs did, not his mind. I reached for my notebook. Where to start? With the provenance of both papers. You will determine who had access to the letter during the past 6 months, and to the codicil prior to its emergence. That intersection will be narrow. Somewhere in it stands the man, or woman, responsible. The radiator hissed again, and outside the fog pressed against the windows like a curious cat. I made a note in my book, flipping back to check dates I'd jotted earlier from Claudia's interview. The letter, I said, was dated in March. She claimed she kept it in her desk at home until she brought it here. The codicil only surfaced last week. Wolfe grunted. And the desk at her home, was it secured? Locked, I said. She's got one of those narrow Yale types. Her maid had the run of the place, but she swears no one went into that drawer. Her word for it. I will not accept her oath as proof, Wolfe said. You will visit, examine the desk, and ascertain whether the lock is worthy of the word. That means seeing Claudia again. She's not going to be pleased. I am not concerned with her pleasure. He shifted slightly, enough to adjust his posture without dislodging so much as a crease in his vest. You will also inquire of her late husband's solicitor whether duplicate copies of the codicil existed, and if so, where they resided before this one emerged. I said, that's going to stir the pond. It must be stirred. I closed the notebook. What about Greaves's fee? You want me to write him a cheque? Yes, generously. His skill is rare. Sure. I got up and moved to the safe in the wall, spun the dial, and came back with Wolfe's chequebook. Writing out a figure that would buy me a decent suit, I tore it off and set it aside for mailing. The phone rang. I crossed to answer, but Wolfe lifted a hand. No. You expecting someone? I expect interruptions. I do not indulge them. The phone went on ringing until it stopped. Wolfe leaned back, eyes half closed again, the picture of a man at rest except for the faint motion of his lips as he murmured to himself. I knew better than to interrupt when he was sifting his mental file. After a minute, he said, Archie, bring me the list of those present at the reading of the will. I fetched the folder from the cabinet. Wolfe opened it, scanning the page with a forefinger. Here, Mr. Hallett, the executor, Miss Dean, the secretary, Claudia, of course, and Mr. Loring, the business partner. All four had opportunity to be alone with one or both documents. Loring? I said. He was there the night the codicil showed up, wasn't he? Yes. You will begin with him. Ascertain his movements in March, particularly any visits to Claudia's house. Won't he smell a rat? I should hope so. A man who does not smell a rat when one is present is of no use to me. I grinned. You've got a way of making friends. I have no interest in friends, Archie. Only in facts. I went to my desk and started drafting a list of questions for Loring. Wolfe sat in silence, eyes drifting toward the orchids in the alcove, though I knew his mind wasn't on the flowers. The fog outside thickened, muting the rumble of crosstown traffic. Somewhere down the block a cab backfired, sharp in the damp air. You want me to see Loring tonight? I asked. Yes, and Miss Dean tomorrow morning, Claudia in the afternoon. That's a lot of shoe leather for one day. It is the nature of the work. I jotted the order in my book, tore the page free, and slipped it into my pocket. When I stood, Wolfe added, Be exact in your questions. Do not announce the forgery, merely probe for access. Got it. Anything else? Yes. Take the codicil copy with you when you see Loring. Observe his reaction when you place it before him. You think he'll flinch? I think he will betray something. Whether guilt or innocence, we shall see. I folded the document into a large envelope, slid it into my inside coat pocket, and headed for the hall. Wolfe's voice stopped me at the door. Archie. Yeah? Do not, under any circumstance, relinquish that envelope to anyone. Understood. The street was slick under the mist when I stepped outside. Lamps made small islands of light on the pavement. I turned up my collar and started for the corner where I could find a cab. Loring's address was on East 72nd, a brownstone half the size of Wolfe's but done up in polished brass and fresh paint. The maid who opened the door was young and unsmiling. I gave her my card and said I needed to see Mr. Loring on business connected to the Hallett estate. She left me in a narrow hall with a gilt mirror and came back a minute later to lead me into a sitting room. Loring was there, tall and spare in a dark suit, a drink in hand. Mr. Goodwin, he said, to what do I owe the honour? I took a seat uninvited. Mr. Wolfe's compliments. We're reviewing some details from March around the time of Mr. Hallett's letter to his wife. Loring's brow lifted. March? That was months before the codicil turned up. Exactly. Did you visit Mrs. Hallett then? Once, perhaps twice, we were finalising certain business transfers. Did you have occasion to be in her study? His gaze held mine for a beat too long. I may have passed through. Why? I took the envelope from my pocket and laid it on the low table between us. Recognize this? He leaned forward, opened the flap, and drew out the codicil. His eyes scanned it, then came back to me. It's the one they read last week. You've seen it before? No, this is my first look. His tone was steady, but his hand twitched as he set it down. I filed that away. You know of anyone who might have had access to both this and the letter from March? I asked. Only Mrs. Hallett. You're certain? He smiled without warmth. If you're implying I forged anything, Mr. Goodwin, I suggest you leave. I stood, taking the envelope. We'll be in touch. Outside, the mist had thickened to a drizzle again. I found a cab and gave the driver Wolfe's address. Back at the brownstone, I hung up my coat and went straight to the office. Wolfe looked up from the book on his lap. Well? He says he's never seen the codicil before last week, but his hand gave a twitch when he handled it. Ah, Wolfe closed the book. And the other matters? I'll see Miss Dean in the morning, Claudia after that. Good. We are closer, Archie. The tracing is the thread. Follow it, and we may find the hand that held the pen. The radiator hissed again, and somewhere in the distance the foghorn of a ferry moaned across the Hudson. In that warm, lamplit office, with Wolfe in his yellow chair and the city muffled outside, the game had moved 1 square forward. The ledger was on thick cream paper, bound in green leather that had seen better decades. Its gilt-edged pages had been smoothed by years of discreet hands, each entry a neat row of names and times that carried the faint proprietary scent of club secrecy. I knew I wasn't supposed to have it, and the maitre d' knew it too, but $50 folded just so, and slipped inside a matchbook can teach paper to travel. The January wind off Madison Avenue had made the ride up here an exercise in endurance. Even with my collar turned high and my hat brim pulled low, the cold had drilled through like it had an appointment with my bones. The minute I stepped into the foyer of the Leland Dinner Club, the shift was instant. The marble under my shoes was polished to a dark gloss, and the air was heavy with the chilled, almost medicinal scent of stone that had never felt a sunrise. Brass sconces on either side of the vestibule glowed low, as if daylight was a vulgarity they didn't allow past the coat check. The head waiter, a thin man with hair like wet ink, had kept his eyes on the ledger as if it was scripture. His voice stayed polite, but it lacked any conviction that I belonged here. The ledger had been on the stand between us, the ink in its fountain pen columns still as precise as the day it was written. Mr. Goodwin, he'd said, this is most irregular. True, I told him, but irregularity is the meat and potatoes of my trade. I'm not asking for your firstborn, just to verify an arrival time. And then the matchbook had slid across the marble counter with a casualness that took both of us a second to appreciate. His fingers had covered it neatly, and he'd lifted the ledger with the other hand as if it weighed a pound less than it had a moment earlier. A practiced motion made me wonder how many matchbooks that stand had seen. The page I wanted was for last Friday night. I ran a fingertip down the neatly inked names until I hit Duval, Franklin P. The columns were clear. Party of 2, table 16, 8:25 p.m. The script was the same as the entries above and below. No later additions, no overwriting. Whoever kept these records had the steady hand of a banker counting someone else's money. That was 40 minutes later than Duval had told Renwick he'd arrived. According to him, he'd been sipping a Gibson at 7:45, but the Leland was 10 minutes by cab from Renwick's office, even with a driver who liked red lights. Which meant that if he'd left the office when he claimed, he'd had half an hour to kill before gracing this marble foyer. Half an hour that now had the appeal of a neon arrow pointing to a gap in his alibi. I closed the book with a soft thud and looked up. The head waiter was pretending to align menus behind the stand, his movements neat enough to be either nervousness or habit. Appreciate your civic spirit, I said. And don't worry, I won't tell anyone you lent this to me for a minute. I should hope not, sir, he murmured, his gaze sliding to the foyer doors where a couple in evening dress were shaking off the cold. I tucked the ledger under my arm, crossed the marble with slow steps to keep from skidding, and pushed out into the night. The cold caught me again like it was waiting. My cab was idling at the curb, the driver hunched over the wheel in a pea coat, smoke curling from the crack in his window. The ride back downtown was quiet except for the rattle of the meter and the hiss of tyres on wet asphalt. I kept the ledger on my knees, running the tip of a finger over the ink of Duval's line. It was easy to imagine him standing in that same marble hall, brushing off his coat, flashing the smile that came with a good tailor's bill, 40 minutes later than he'd sworn. By the time I stepped into the brownstone, the hall smelled faintly of Fritz's onion soup, which meant it was edging toward the hour Wolfe preferred to sit down. The front room was warm enough to make the tips of my ears ache as they thawed. I hung my coat and hat, locked the street out behind me, and went into the office. Wolfe was in the yellow chair, leaning back just far enough that his eyes were half-lidded without being shut. His right hand rested on the arm, fingers still, his left holding a slim book whose spine I couldn't read from the door. The orchids would be waiting upstairs in the plant rooms, but for now his attention was mine to claim. "Well?" he said, without looking up. I laid the ledger on his desk blotter, turning it so the page faced him. Duval's entry, 8:25, not 7:45. The Leland's about 10 minutes from Renwick's office, give or take a light. That got his eyes on the page. He didn't touch the book, just leaned forward enough to read the neat black script. "Who keeps these records?" "The head waiter. Writes them in as guests arrive. Same hand for the whole evening. No smudges, no signs of tampering." "And you are certain of the interval between the club and Renwick's address?" "I timed it once when I was meeting a girl there for dinner. Same block, same hour. 10 minutes and a couple of quarters for the driver." He made a sound in his throat that could have meant agreement or that the soup needed salt. So Duval's margin for mischief was half an hour. Give or take a couple minutes if his driver was in a mood. Wolfe leaned back again, closing his eyes. Satisfactory. It phrased the alibi without destroying it. We shall see what else may be pulled from that thread. I took the ledger back from his blotter and set it on the corner of my desk. "Do I return this tonight?" "In the morning. Too late now to avoid questions at the club." That was Wolfe for you. Respectable timing for everything, even returning borrowed evidence. He shifted slightly, his gaze moving past me to the far wall. "Saul Pantzer is at liberty?" "Far as I know." "Call him. He is to begin discreet observation of Claudia and Lanford, separately, but with enough overlap to note if their paths cross." I crossed to the phone, lifted the receiver, and had the exchange put me through to Saul's number. His voice came on calm and steady like it always did, even when the job was sideways. "Saul," I said, "Wolfe wants you to keep tabs on 2 people. Claudia first, Lanford second. Quiet work, no ripples. Start tonight if you can swing it." There was the faint scratch of a match at his end, then an exhale. "You got addresses?" I read them off from my notebook, gave him a couple of likely haunts for each, and told him I'd have more if the ground shifted. When I hung up, Wolfe was watching me, his fingertips pressed together in front of him. "Saul will suffice for this. I dislike the thought of Claudia stirring trouble unseen." "She's not the only one. Lanford's been too careful lately, like he's saving his best lies for the right audience." Wolfe's mouth curved in what passed for a smile. "We may yet provide him that audience." I leaned back in my chair, the ledger between us like a silent witness. Outside, a gust rattled the window panes and the faint murmur of traffic was softened by the double glass. The brownstone felt secure, the way it always did when Wolfe was where he belonged and the locks were turned. "Want me to dig into where Duval might have been during that half hour?" I asked. "Yes, but with caution. If he learns we have the ledger, he will alter his stance." I nodded. "You want it subtle, it'll be subtle. I'll talk to the doorman at Renwick's building first, then see if any hack drivers remember him between 8 and 8:30. "Do so. And Archie, keep the ledger in your possession until you return it. Do not trust it to the mails or to a messenger." "Right." I slid it into the bottom drawer of my desk and turned the key. The smell of Fritz's soup was stronger now, telling me the bowls would be on the table in minutes. Wolfe glanced at the clock and closed his eyes again. That was my cue to let the silence settle until the dinner bell, and then the work would wait until the plates were cleared and the coffee poured. But the ledger's neat little line of ink had already rewritten one man's story, and I had the feeling it was going to be the kind of thread that, once you pulled it, would keep coming until the whole suit was in your hands. The rain had let up by the time Saul stepped into the office, but he carried the damp with him in the crease of his coat collar and the faint dark patches at the brim of his hat. He shut the door carefully, glanced once toward Wolfe in the yellow chair, and then came across to my desk with the unhurried stride of a man whose work was already done before he crossed the threshold. I slid the phone aside. "You've got that look. Something wrapped up in brown paper and string?" Not string, Saul said, lowering himself into one of the red chairs without a glance for the orchid's corner upstairs. Paper, yes. 2 days ago, Claudia went into Denton and Roper's on West 47th. You know the place? I did. Denton and Roper's was a midtown stationery shop, with windows dressed in green felt and glass cases where the ink pens gleamed like surgical instruments. If you wanted a monogram that would outlast the century, or a batch of embossed letterhead that said you had arrived, you went there. And Denton and Roper's kept stock of the exact heavy cream paper we'd seen in the codicil. Custom watermark, faint enough to be modest, expensive enough to make a point. Did she buy? I asked. Saul's eyes were steady. I didn't see the sale. She was inside 9 minutes, left with a flat parcel wrapped in brown paper. I let that sit between us for a moment. 2 days ago would have been the afternoon I came back from Boston, a day earlier than planned. Wolfe stirred in his chair. The lamplight caught the angle of his cheek, the rest of his face in shadow. You have considered the coincidence? Considering it now, I said. If Claudia was counting on me being out of the way until Wednesday, she might have thought she had more time to play courier. My showing up a day early could have rattled her. And advanced the schedule, Wolfe finished. His voice was mild, but the shape of the thought was sharp. Renwick died before he could speak to me. That suggests haste, and haste is often the ally of folly. Saul shifted his hat to the low table beside him, not making a sound against the polished wood. I can sit on Denton and Roper's, see if she goes back. No, Wolfe said, not yet. If she returns, it will not be for that paper. She has what she required. Observation should remain with her person, not her haunts. Saul inclined his head once, agreement without ornament, and settled back. I leaned an elbow on my blotter. If she bought that paper for the codicil, then she's either working for the forger or is the forger. Wolfe's eyes closed briefly, as if to give the words their own quiet in the room. Yes, and if she is the forger, she is almost certainly the murderer. The two acts are not easily divided. Forgery in this context is not merely a matter of profit. It is a means to secure the desired end. If Renwick knew or suspected, he was an obstacle. The rain outside had slowed to a fine hiss against the glass, the sort of weather that blurred the lamps on West 35th into pale coins. I thought about Boston, the train pulling in ahead of schedule, the key in the brownstone's lock, Wolfe's eyebrows lifting when I appeared in the doorway with my bag. At the time, the early return had felt like nothing more than an extra night in my own bed. Now, it had the shape of a stone dropped in the middle of someone else's pond. She didn't see me get back, I said. Not right away, but if she was keeping tabs, she might have learned within hours, Wolfe said, enough to prompt an alteration. If her plan was to act after Renwick's interview with me, she might have feared that his account would implicate her. Better to act sooner, before that interview could occur. Saul's gaze moved between us, not quick but deliberate. You think she knew what he planned to say? Perhaps, Wolfe allowed, or perhaps she suspected enough to feel endangered. In either case, a nervous mind in her position would see advantage in preempting the meeting. I rose and crossed to the cabinet, poured 3 fingers of rye into a glass, and came back to my desk. Wolfe didn't drink before dinner, and Saul seldom did on a job, so the bottle stayed where it was. The rye burned the chill out of my throat and left a heat that suited the thought I'd been edging toward. If she's both forger and killer, that simplifies the roster, I said. But it means she's bolder than we pegged her. Buying the paper in Midtown, carrying it out in daylight, it's not shy work. Confidence is a cloak, Wolfe said. It can conceal as well as attract notice. Many will not suspect what is done openly. I set the glass down and looked to Saul. Anyone else in Denton and Roper's notice her? He shook his head. 2 clerks, neither looking at the door, no other customers. Which meant she'd chosen her moment. Either luck or careful timing. In our line, the former often wore the latter's coat. The wall clock ticked away the last minute before Fritz's bell for dinner. Wolfe's eyes flicked to it, then back to me. You will speak with Denton and Roper, discreetly. Learn the nature of the purchase if possible without revealing our interest. That'll take a silver tongue and maybe some silver, I said. Employ both, Wolfe told me. I made a note in my book, the kind written small enough to be legible only to me. Across from me, Saul had settled deeper into the red chair, as if his job here was done for the moment. It was, but he'd wait for Wolfe's formal dismissal. Saul played by house rules. Wolfe turned a page in the book on his lap, though I doubted he was reading it now. Archie, your early return may have altered the killer's timing. This is not to be regretted. Acceleration often leaves imperfections, errors we may discern. I'll take the blame for that gladly, I said. If she slipped, I want to see where. Fritz's step sounded in the hall, even and unhurried, and then the dining room door opened just enough for the chime to carry in. Wolfe closed the book, placed it on the small table beside his chair, and levered himself up with the care of a man keeping the balance between dignity and appetite. "Mr. Pantzer," he said, "maintain your watch on Claudia. Avoid contact unless necessity dictates. Mr. Goodwin, tomorrow you will attend to Denton and Roper before luncheon." Saul rose, collected his hat, and nodded once. "I'll call in if she moves anywhere interesting." We all stepped toward the hall together, the faint aroma of Fritz's braised veal already claiming the air. Outside, the lamps would be haloed in mist and Midtown's shopfronts shuttered against the weather. Somewhere among them, a flat brown parcel had changed hands 2 days ago, carrying with it the weight of a man's death and a woman's mistake. It was nearing 6 when I stepped into the cab, gave the driver an address on East 73rd, and let the damp wind from the open window ruffle my hat brim. The day had been sullen, low clouds hanging over Manhattan, glints of wet pavement catching the glow of street lamps, and the summons from Margaret Lanford had been as discreet as it was unexpected. Her voice on the telephone had been steady, low, and careful. She wished, she'd said, to discuss a matter touching upon her husband. It was important, and she would rather not speak of it at her club. The driver let me out before the sandstone stoop of a narrow-fronted house, its facade freshly scrubbed, but with the old-fashioned iron railings polished to a dull gleam. The maid who answered took my name and showed me into a small front parlour. The room was dim, lit by a pair of shaded lamps and the last dribble of daylight through lace curtains. The first thing that reached me was the scent, faint, unmistakable, and deliberate, lilac perfume, the sort you remembered hours later if you noticed it at all. Margaret Lanford rose from a low chair near the fireplace. She was a tall woman, with auburn hair drawn back neatly, and she wore a dove-grey dress that said Fifth Avenue without needing to shout. She extended a hand, cool and dry, and indicated a seat opposite her. "Mr. Goodwin," she said, "I appreciate your coming. I'm aware that my husband has engaged your Mr. Wolfe before, and I am not altogether certain he would welcome my speaking to you now." "That," I told her, settling back, "would depend entirely on the topic and the company. At present, I have no complaints on either count." A faint smile curved her mouth, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. She reached to the small table beside her chair, lifted a stiff brown envelope and offered it across. I took it, slid out a single sheet of folded paper, and laid it open on my knee. It was a bill from Hammond's Office Machines, dated the Tuesday before Renwick's death. The repair line item was for a Royal Quiet Deluxe typewriter, platen adjustment, cleaning, ribbon change, billed to Mr. Thomas Lanford. I kept my eyes on the page a moment longer, enough to notice the machine's serial number printed neatly under customer's reference. I'd seen that number before, at the top of a sheet in Wolfe's office, on the carbon from the codicil that had brought us into the matter. "I see," I said. "Yes," she murmured. "You see, I noticed the bill in our Morning Post. My husband made no mention of having the machine serviced, and I am aware of what was typed upon it." I refolded the bill and set it back in its envelope. "You're certain it's the same machine?" "It is. We have had it for years, kept in the study at the rear of the house. I typed our Christmas letters on it myself until last year." Her gaze moved past me to the drawn curtains as if aligning her thoughts. "I am not naive, Mr. Goodwin. My marriage has been altered for some time. Thomas and I no longer share the ease we once did. He has—" She hesitated, then chose the words with care. "Taken liberties with the truth." The lilac scent seemed stronger for the pause, though it was only the still air holding it close. I kept my tone neutral. "Meaning you don't believe him if he says the repair was routine?" "I mean," she said, meeting my eyes at last, "that I have reason to think he lent that machine to another, and for a purpose he would rather not have me suspect. I'm not in the habit of intercepting his correspondence, but when the post arrived that morning I happened to be at the table. The envelope was unsealed." I let the silence stand, the way Wolfe would have, though without his closed eyes and folded hands. Margaret Lanford was no client in the office, but the truth was better coaxed than chased. She drew a slow breath. I do not say that my husband had anything to do with Mr. Renwick's death, but I have heard the whispers. I know there was some question of a will, of an additional clause, and I know that if Thomas was involved even at a remove it will come to light. I would rather it come to light in a manner I can endure. Her fingers rested lightly on the arm of her chair, the nails short and polished to a pale sheen. I'd seen women in her position choose to look away, to keep the marriage whole on paper. This one was choosing something else. Why not bring this to the police, I asked. She gave a small, precise shake of her head. They would take it as proof of guilt. I'm not prepared to see my husband treated as a criminal, yet. But neither will I shield him if he has brought shame upon us. Mr. Wolfe has a reputation for sorting matters to their proper corners. That is what I hope for now. I returned the envelope to her table. I can't promise results, Mrs. Lanford, but I can promise Wolfe will know of this before the evening's out. That is all I ask. She glanced toward the door, then back. I would prefer you did not call here again unless I send for you. Thomas would read too much into it. Which was her way of saying she'd tell me if there was more to tell. I rose, and she did the same, offering her hand once more. The perfume was there again, faint but persistent, as my fingers closed around hers. On the way out, I noted the study door at the far end of the hall was shut, the key turned. Whether the Royal was inside, and whether its platen was as newly adjusted as Hammond's claimed, I didn't have the liberty to find out just then. The maid saw me to the door, and the street met me with a gust that rattled the bare branches over the stoop. The lamps were up, shining on wet brick, and somewhere farther downtown a horn moaned against the traffic. I turned toward the avenue, the envelope's contents fixed in my mind, and began thinking about how Wolfe would pass the phrase "taken liberties with the truth." It would, I knew, involve more than a raised brow and a quotation from Montaigne. Wolfe would want to know who else might have sat at that machine between the Tuesday repair and Renwick's death, and why the bill had come to Margaret instead of vanishing into her husband's desk. By the time I found a cab, the wind had picked up, carrying the smell of damp stone and gasoline. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was in the office, yellow chair tilted to accommodate his bulk, eyes half-lidded against the lamplight. I handed him the envelope without a word. He read the bill, once, twice, and then placed it on the desk blotter. "Pfui," he said softly. "If this be true, it is either a trap or a confession." "Her money's on confession," I told him. Wolfe reached for the beer Fritz had left at his elbow. "And yours?" "Too soon to place a bet. But if the Royal in Lanford's study has fresh innards and a willing memory, we might not need odds." His eyes opened fully, dark and steady. "Then we must contrive to examine it. Mr. Lanford will not invite us. We will require a pretext." Which, in Wolfe's world, meant I would be the one to find it. I dropped into the red chair, the lilac still faint in my nose, and considered how best to get another look at a typewriter without a warrant, a husband's blessing, or a wife's second summons. The rain had settled into one of those persistent Manhattan drizzles that did not so much fall as hang in the air, dampening collars and moods without the drama of a downpour. Inside the brownstone, with the office door closed and the radiator hissing a low accompaniment to the patter outside, Wolfe was planted in the yellow chair, eyes narrowed at a point somewhere above the desk blotter. I had seen that look before. It meant the wheels were turning, though he would probably object to so plebeian a term. I had just finished transcribing the morning's notes from our interview with Mr. Albee, the junior partner at Renwick and Shaw. It had been a stiff exchange, with Albee giving up only the bare minimum in the way of cooperation. But the timings had been clear enough. Renwick had left the office at 10:30 that morning, returned at 11, gone again just after 1. Somewhere between his last return and the moment his body was discovered, he had been visited by someone with a key to his private office. Wolfe reached for the bottle of beer Fritz had placed on the side table, poured with the precision of a man who valued the head on a brew as much as some men valued their fortunes, and set the glass within easy reach. His eyes came down to mine. "Archie," he said, "we have been, I think, distracted by the codicil." "That's a polite way of saying we've been chasing the wrong rabbit," I replied. "Not wrong," he allowed, "but incomplete. The forgery was real, the motive plausible. Yet the circumstances, the entry, the absence of ransack in the outer room, the removal of only certain objects, require that we attend to another likelihood." I leaned back in the red chair and let him spin it out. "Wolfe, when he was ready to unfold a theory, did not appreciate interruptions, and the trick was to avoid prodding him without losing the thread. In the testimony you recorded, he went on, several witnesses observed Mr. Renwick carrying in recent days a small stack of ledger books from his office to his home. He told the clerk in the outer office that these were old client records, yet when Kramer telephoned an hour ago, he informed me that Renwick's office safe, where such records were normally kept, was empty. Empty? I sat forward. Not even the petty cash? Quite. Every drawer within, every shelf, cleared. He sipped his beer. What do you deduce? That whoever killed him wasn't after just the codicil. They wanted those ledgers too, maybe more than they wanted the codicil. Wolfe inclined his head, a concession of sorts. Precisely. The removal of all content suggests purpose beyond mere concealment of the forged clause. These records, if they were what I think, may have contained entries implicating more than one man in conduct better kept private. The radiator hissed, the rain brushed the glass. I could picture Renwick's office, polished desk, brass-handled safe, the smell of leather and ink. I'd been in enough such rooms to know that the real valuables weren't always measured in dollars or gems. In the hands of the right or wrong party, a ledger could be as potent as a pistol. You're thinking blackmail? I asked. I am thinking leverage, Wolfe corrected. The capacity to compel action by threat of exposure. That such records were removed entire rather than selectively indicates haste or the wish to obliterate the trail altogether. He set down his glass, steepled his fingers and closed his eyes, not in rest, but in the sort of concentration that drew the lines deeper into his face. This would explain, he continued, the peculiar timing. The codicil could have been intercepted at any point in its drafting, yet the murder occurred only after these records had been gathered. The killer struck when both objectives were at hand. Two birds with one stone, I said. An apt but vulgar idiom, he murmured. In this instance the stone was murder, and the birds, two distinct threats to two distinct parties, were removed in a single throw. Before I could reply, the phone rang. I swiveled to pick it up. Nero Wolfe's office, Archie Goodwin speaking. Kramer's voice came through, carrying that familiar combination of gravel and impatience. Goodwin, put him on. I've got news. I covered the mouthpiece. For you, from Kramer. Says he's got news. Wolfe opened his eyes, extended a hand without rising, and took the receiver. Yes, Inspector? I could hear the rumble of Kramer's report even from across the desk, but not the words. Wolfe listened without interruption, save for the occasional indeed or yes. When he set the receiver back in its cradle, his expression had altered only slightly. Less speculation, more confirmation. Kramer has had the contents of Renwick's office catalogued, he said. The safe was emptied between 11:30 and 12. No sign of forced entry. His secretary swears the only keys were in Renwick's possession, save for the duplicate kept in the partner's strongbox. That duplicate is missing. And who had access to the strongbox? Both partners, and, on occasion, the senior clerk. I whistled softly. So we've got a forged codicil that could benefit one man, and missing records that could sink one or more others. Plenty of motive to go around. Too much, Wolfe said curtly. It complicates the inquiry, which is why the police will find it intolerable. He reached for his beer again. Our task is to untangle the overlap. I could see the shape of it forming, the neat symmetry that Wolfe always sought. Somewhere in those ledgers had been an entry, or several, tying Renwick's associates to dealings they couldn't afford to see in daylight. If the killer was one of them, the codicil might have been an opportunity rather than the cause. You think the same person had reason to want both gone? I asked. I think it likely, he said, but not certain. It is possible that the murder was committed to obtain the records, and the codicil's disappearance was a convenient adjunct, perhaps even performed by another hand afterward. Meaning we could have two culprits instead of one, I said. That is what the facts permit. The rain had thickened, drumming now against the panes. I thought about the logistics. If Renwick's killer had taken the ledgers, where had they gone? Dumped, burned, locked away. If they were damning enough, keeping them was dangerous. Destroying them, safer. Unless, of course, the killer intended to use them. You mentioned leverage, I said. If they're using it, how do we find out? By observation and inference, Wolfe replied. Those under threat will betray themselves, not by confession, but by alteration in habit, in speech, in the direction of their caution. We must look for those whose conduct shifts without apparent cause, which meant more interviews, more note-taking, and more evenings chasing statements around Manhattan's better drawing rooms. Wolfe would sit here, collating from the red leather-bound notebooks I filled. I didn't mind. Manhattan in the rain had its own sort of rhythm, and if you knew the streets you could learn things the pavement didn't say aloud. The phone rang again, this time a shorter burst. I answered. It was Mrs. Renwick, her voice low and edged with the kind of restraint that comes from speaking within earshot of someone you don't trust. She had remembered something about the day before her husband's death, a visitor he had received unannounced who stayed less than 10 minutes but left him visibly shaken. I wrote it down, asked for a description, and hung up. She says it was a man in his 50s, tall, dark hair gone to silver, wore a camel hair coat, no name given, no appointment. Wolfe's brow creased. Not Albie, he said. Possibly Mr. Crandall, the former client whose accounts Renwick managed privately. You think Crandall's in the records? I think, Wolfe said slowly, that if we knew the nature of Renwick's private accounts, we might discern why those records were dangerous enough to warrant murder. Crandall's affairs, from what I recall, have weathered certain irregularities. That was Wolfe's polite way of saying shady. I made a note to find out where Crandall spent his afternoons. Do you want me to? Yes, Wolfe said, cutting me off. Quietly. And take care that you are not observed making inquiries about the ledgers. The party who removed them will be alert to such interest. The rest of the afternoon slid by in the slow, deliberate manner Wolfe preferred when he was constructing the architecture of a case. Outside, the rain polished the street to a black mirror, and the occasional swish of tyres carried through the closed windows. I spent an hour cross-checking the timetable against the statements, noting where alibis thinned or overlapped. Wolfe dictated a list of persons to be seen again, their names in the order he wanted them approached. By the time Fritz announced dinner, we had a working theory. Renwick's murder had served at least two purposes, and the real prize might not have been the codicil at all. The ledgers, if we could find them, would tell us whether the killer was protecting himself, serving another, or both. After dinner, Wolfe returned to the office and resumed his post in the yellow chair, the lamplight warming the edges of his face. I sat opposite with the day's notes, arranging them into the neat columns he favoured. You understand, he said finally, that this complicates our position with Kramer. The police will pursue the codicil as the principal motive. If we attempt to direct them toward the records without proof, they will resist. So we get proof, I said. Indeed, but the proof may lie in a place neither we nor they can reach without consent, or without provocation. Which meant manoeuvring someone into revealing they had the records. Dangerous work, even for me. Wolfe regarded me over the steeple of his fingers. Do not be reckless, Archie. These records, if my surmise is correct, could unseat men of substantial influence. They will not be relinquished willingly. I'll wear my thickest suit, I said, but the weight in his tone wasn't lost on me. The night drew in fully, rain easing to a fine mist that silvered the street lamps. I left him there with his thoughts and his orchids waiting upstairs, the image of a brass-handled safe standing open and empty lodged in my mind. Somewhere in Manhattan, a stack of ledgers was hidden, their pages thick with names and numbers that could topple reputations. The codicil might have been the bait, but those records, those were the real catch. And if Wolfe was right, finding them would bring more than just the killer into the light. The bell above the shop door gave a small, tinny ring as I stepped inside. It was the kind of sound that didn't so much announce you as politely clear its throat. The air was warm after the February chill, carrying a mixture of paper dust, sizing, and a faint, sharp tang I couldn't place at first. The shop was narrow, a long glass counter on the left, stacked pigeonholes behind it, and shelves that climbed to the ceiling with their regimented ranks of envelopes, paper reams, and boxed pens. Mrs. Rourke, the owner, looked up from behind the counter where she was tallying a column in an old ledger. She had a neat coiffure of iron-grey hair, a dark dress buttoned high at the throat, and the brisk manner of a woman who could run the place blindfolded. I offered a smile I'd used before on reluctant witnesses. Afternoon, Mrs. Rourke. Archie Goodwin. I believe we spoke on the telephone about Miss Claudia. Her eyes measured me for a moment, then she nodded, closing the ledger with deliberate care. Yes, Mr. Goodwin. You said you were assisting Mr. Wolfe. That's right. He sends his regards. I rested an elbow lightly on the glass. I understand Miss Claudia was in here about a week ago. She was. Mrs. Rourke moved to a drawer beneath the counter and withdrew a folded slip. Ordered a packet of legal foolscap, cream finish, watermarked. Special order. We keep the smaller quantities in back. I noted the date, 2 days before the codicil appeared. Anything else with that order? Mrs. Rourke hesitated, then reached for another slip from beneath the first. Yes, a bottle of iron gall ink, imported, not something we sell every day. The faint tang I'd noticed sharpened in my nose as she produced a small, half-empty bottle from the shelf behind her. She set it on the counter, and the smell was unmistakable, metallic with a whisper of vinegar, the sort of scent that lingers in a room long after the writing is done. "Mind if I take a look?" I asked. She nodded, and I picked it up. The glass was cool, the liquid inside a deep blue-black with a slight bronze sheen when it caught the light. The label was in neat serif print, Hammersmith & Lowe iron gall writing fluid. Old-fashioned, I remarked. Doesn't everyone use fountain pen ink these days? For ordinary work, yes, she said. Iron gall is for archival documents, certificates, formal records. It bites into the paper fibres, impossible to erase without damage, but it oxidizes as it dries, and if the formula's a bit off, the colour fades unevenly over the years. I turned the bottle in my hand, thinking about the codicil's signature, dark, crisp, as if penned yesterday. So, if someone used this a few days ago, it would look fresh for quite a while before starting to fade. She gave a small shrug. That's so, and some batches do not hold their colour evenly, leaves a sort of mottled tone as it ages. It didn't take a Wolfe to fit that into the puzzle. The codicil's signature had been the sticking point. It looked new, yet was claimed to be months old, a perfect match for an obliging ink. Miss Claudia paid cash? I asked. She did, exact change as I recall. I thanked her, left a card in case she remembered anything further, and stepped back into the street. The February air felt sharper now, the metallic tang lingering in my nostrils. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was in the office, settled in the yellow chair with a half-empty glass of beer on the stand beside him. He looked up as I came in, eyes narrowing at the bottle in my hand. "You have acquired something." "From Mrs. Rourke at the stationery shop. Claudia bought her legal paper there, and this." I set the bottle on his desk blotter. He leaned forward just enough to examine the label, then sat back. "Iron gall ink." "Exactly. She bought it 2 days before the codicil turned up. Mrs. Rourke says it's the kind that fades unevenly over time, which explains why the signature still looks fresh. It's had no time to fade at all." Wolfe's lips compressed. He reached for the bottle, uncorked it, and held it beneath his nose. The sharp metallic scent filled the room. "Yes," he said softly. "Ferric tannet. The odour is unmistakable." He recorked it, set it precisely before him. A convenient medium for deception. I dropped into the red chair. So that ties her directly to the forgery materials. "It ties her to the purchase of the materials," Wolfe corrected, "from which you infer intent. The law will require more." She had motive, she had the paper, and now we know she had the ink. What more do we need? "Proof," Wolfe said, with that irritating finality of his. "Archie, forging a codicil is one crime, murder is another. They are not automatically conjoined. A person might commit the former without resorting to the latter." I stretched my legs. "Then you think someone else might have done the killing?" "I think," he said, "that until we have traced the full sequence of possession, paper, ink, document, we cannot assert who wielded the pen, let alone who wielded the weapon." The radiator hissed. Outside, a horn sounded faintly through the winter air. I watched Wolfe studying the bottle as if it were a rare orchid, and I wondered if Claudia realized that one careless purchase might have just unravelled her story. "She'll deny it," I said. "Of course," Wolfe replied, "and she may even believe her denial if she convinces herself it was for some other purpose. Our task is to discover whether that is so, or whether she lies." I leaned forward. "You want me to press her?" "Not yet. First you will determine whether any other party connected to this affair purchased such ink in recent weeks. If she is singular in that regard, the inference strengthens. And if there's more than one, then we have a complication, which I dislike but must accept." I picked up the bottle again, feeling the cool weight of the glass. The scent clung to my fingers, a sharp reminder that in this business, even the smallest trace can point a straight path to the truth, if you know how to follow it. Wolfe watched me. "Leave it here. Fritz will find a suitable place to keep it until it is required." I set it back on the desk. "Fine, but sooner or later we're going to have to confront her with it." "Yes," Wolfe said, reaching for his beer, "but not before we are ready. Premature revelation is the enemy of persuasion." The lamplight gleamed off the bottle's curve, the ink inside dark as midnight. Somewhere in Claudia's mind there would be a moment when the memory of that purchase surfaced, unbidden and unwelcome. When it did, I intended to be there to see it. The room was still, save for the low tick of the mantel clock. It marked each second with a precise, almost ceremonial beat, the way an usher might clear his throat before a witness spoke. Outside, the February night lay over the city, but here in the office the lamplight was steady and warm, holding the darkness at bay. Wolfe sat in the yellow chair, his bulk settled as if he had not moved in an hour, forearms resting on the chair's arms, fingertips touching. His gaze was on me, but I knew the thoughts behind it were lining up in the exact order he wished them to stand. "You will give me the sequence again," he said. I had already given it twice, but Wolfe's appetite for order could match his appetite for beef. "Renwick met me at 6:30, I began, leaning back in the red chair. "That was in the lounge at the Claremont. He stayed there until just after 7, when he left to keep what he called a prior engagement. The next fixed point we've got is the murder, 8:15. Duval walked into the club at 8:25, and Lanford's alibi still hangs without a hook, nobody to confirm his story." Wolfe's eyelids lowered, not quite a blink, more the slow descent of shutters over a bright window. The clock gave another click into the silence. "Renwick's meeting with you," he said, "places him in a context of opportunity. Duval's arrival after the fact gives him one of propinquity, not of commission. Lanford's uncorroborated alibi renders him suspect. But there is another dimension." He inclined his head a fraction. "The forgery." I shifted in my seat. "You're thinking about the signature on the codicil?" "I am," Wolfe said. "It was traced. That much is clear from the pen pressure and the congruence of the strokes. But one cannot trace without a model, and the model in this instance could only be found among Mrs. Claudia's personal correspondence, letters, contracts, intimate notes, not the sort of thing one may locate in a public archive." That was a point I hadn't stated, but he was right. The signature had been a perfect match, down to a flourish that most people would leave for the bank. "Meaning," I said, "the pool shrinks to those who had a way into her desk." "Precisely," Wolfe said. The word hung in the air like cigar smoke. The clock ticked. I watched him turn the pieces in his mind. For Wolfe, a timeline wasn't just a chart of hours, it was a sieve, shaking out the chaff. I put a leg over my knee. "So, who had that access? Aside from Claudia herself, there's her maid, who swears she doesn't touch the desk. Renwick, who could have been in the apartment when she wasn't looking Lanford, if he ever visited socially, and possibly Duval, though I can't see her inviting him into the inner sanctum." Wolfe's mouth twitched. "You are neglecting one obvious possibility, that she herself provided the signature." I considered that. Claudia, as architect of her own forgery, wasn't impossible, though it bent the line of her earlier statements into an awkward shape. If she did, she'd have to be certain no one could prove the ink was fresh, and she'd know the risk if it ever came to light. "She would," Wolfe agreed. He reached for his glass of beer, lifting it with the same economy he applied to speech. Yet people do improbable things under the pressure of gain or fear. He sipped, set the glass back with a soft clink. The clock ticked again, the sound louder now in the pause. "Let us," Wolfe said, "apply the constraint. Access to the correspondence is the limiting factor. Without it, no tracing. Without tracing, no forgery. Without forgery, no motive to silence a man who might reveal it. Therefore, I finished, the killer is someone who could get into that desk, take out a letter, and copy the signature without anyone knowing." "Yes." Wolfe's gaze rested on the row of books opposite as if one of them might nod in agreement. "And you will now determine, with care, who had such an opportunity in the days before the codicil's appearance." "That's narrowing it to a very small club," I said. Smaller than you think, Wolfe replied. Renwick was with you at 6:30. The murder occurred less than 2 hours later. If he is the forger, the tracing was done earlier. Lanford's alibi being uncorroborated may conceal a visit to her apartment. Duval's prompt arrival after the crime suggests he was near at hand, but does not place him at her desk. I ran the list again in my head. And Claudia? Mrs. Claudia, Wolfe said, remains an open question. Her motives are veiled, her candour unreliable. But she too is constrained by the clock. I looked at the actual clock. The brass hand stood a minute before 10. Its steady voice counted the space between thoughts. If you're right, I said, then the key isn't who wanted him dead. It's who could have forged that signature. Yes. Wolfe closed his eyes briefly. And once that is fixed, the rest will follow as the night the day. You will go out tomorrow, make your inquiries, and bring me the residue. I rose. All right, but it's going to mean asking questions in places where people don't like their names in statements. That, Wolfe said, is why you are you, and I am I. The clock gave one more decisive tick, as if endorsing the arrangement. The winter rain had not ceased, its fine percussion faint against the brownstone's front windows. The lamps were lit, a mellow glow steady across the desk's polished surface. Wolfe sat deep in the yellow chair, massive hands resting on the armrests as if they had been placed there by a sculptor. His gaze fixed upon me was calm, but I had seen enough of him to know that calm meant the gears behind his eyes were in swift rotation. Archie, he said, the syllables even. You will now hear the full measure. I set down my notebook. All right, I'm braced. He inclined his head, lids low. Margaret Lanford was not, as you presumed, an innocent herald of truth. Her posture as a whistleblower was calculated. I leaned back. Calculated by her or by Duval? By both, Wolfe said. His voice was deliberate, each phrase placed like a chess piece. They conspired to employ the forged codicil as a lever against Renwick. Margaret supplied access to the correspondence from which Claudia's hand could be traced. Claudia performed the forgery without knowledge that blood would follow. Duval intended the codicil as a means of extortion. Margaret was his accomplice. The words settled into the quiet, as precise as drops into a still pool. I kept my tone flat. So when Renwick didn't dance to their tune, Duval silenced him, Wolfe finished. An expedient solution from his view, but one which left Margaret with the problem of diverting suspicion. She placed the typewriter bill in her husband's coat to frame him. The hope was to marry her husband's ruin with her own preservation. The office air seemed denser. I studied Wolfe, trying to gauge whether this was deduction or certainty. He reached for the glass of beer on the stand at his right and sipped without haste. You're hanging a heavy coat on her shoulders, I said. I am hanging her own coat, Wolfe replied. Returned from the cleaner, stains intact. I let that sit a moment. The clock on the mantel gave a restrained tick. Section 5, Wolfe went on, gave us the trace of Claudia's hand in the codicil. Section 7 established Margaret's unobserved interval in Claudia's apartment, while Claudia was absent. And Section 9 demonstrated that the typewriter bill was introduced after her husband had no cause to be in possession of it. These strands combined define the pattern. I crossed one leg over the other. She's never going to admit it. Admission is unnecessary. Confrontation will suffice. The rain outside deepened, a soft hiss on the glass. Fritz's movements in the kitchen were faint, metal upon wood. I said, Claudia's role then, limited to the forgery. Yes, Wolfe said, she was the artisan, not the assassin. Her purpose was to aid Margaret in what she believed was a civil manoeuvre, altering the codicil to reassign a modest inheritance. She was not apprised that the forgery would become an instrument for murder. That fit the impression Claudia had given me, worldly enough to risk fraud, not cold enough to calculate a killing. Wolfe's eyes closed briefly, a slow blink. Margaret, however, was fully aware of the leverage a forged testamentary instrument could afford. Duval's presence in her scheme was inevitable. His appetite for advantage is congenital. I got up and paced to the window. The street lamps on West 35th shone through the rain in fractured halos. If we go to her now, she'll know we've got her cornered. She will know, Wolfe said, and she will consider her options. Those options will be constrained by her understanding that I know every act she has committed in this sordid sequence. You will arrange her attendance tomorrow morning. I turned back. And Duval? Margaret will bring him. She will hope to dilute her culpability by casting him as the principal. He, in turn, will attempt to shift the weight to her. The friction will yield heat. In that heat, truth will appear. The clock ticked again, a calm metronome. Wolfe leaned back, the faintest sigh escaping him, as though another layer of the case had fallen neatly into place. I stood by the window, listening to the rain and considering the morning to come. The office air carried the rich aroma of Fritz's coffee, drifting from the kitchen as if to steady nerves before battle. Wolfe occupied his yellow chair, immovable as an oak, eyes half-lidded yet sharp. I had arranged the red chairs in a tidy arc before the desk. The guests filled them, Margaret Lanford stiff-backed, Duval restless in his seat, Claudia, pale but composed, and Inspector Kramer, planted near the bookshelves with his arms folded. Wolfe cleared his throat, the small sound drawing all eyes. "You have each given statements," he began, "and each statement contained defects." His gaze shifted from face to face. "This evening, we shall address them." He started with Claudia. "The traced signature on the codicil, your work. You employed her husband's genuine letter as a model. The paper and ink were purchased together. Iron gall ink, as Mr. Goodwin confirmed, which fades irregularly." Claudia's lips parted, but she said nothing. Wolfe turned to Duval. "Your presence at the club at 8:25 was intended as an alibi, but the ledger from the club's reception shows no entry at that hour. Instead, you signed in at 8:37. The murder occurred before you arrived." Duval's jaw tightened. "Mrs. Lanford," Wolfe went on, "your alibi rests on the claim you were with friends at the time. Not one corroborates you. And the typewriter bill, found in your husband's coat, was placed there by you. A crude effort, meant to shift suspicion." Margaret's eyes narrowed, but she kept her hands folded in her lap. Wolfe gestured to me. I stepped forward and placed a small leather folio on the desk. He opened it with care, revealing ledgers and financial statements. "These," Wolfe said, "are Renwick's missing financial records. Mr. Panzer recovered them from a bank box registered to Mr. Duval. They record payments made to an account in Mrs. Lanford's maiden name. The pattern is clear: money to secure silence and later to secure cooperation." The room contracted. The tick of the mantel clock became pronounced, marking each second with patient authority. "You two," Wolfe said, fixing Duval and Margaret with equal weight, "used the forged codicil as leverage. When Renwick refused your terms, Mr. Duval killed him. Mrs. Lanford sought to shield herself by directing suspicion elsewhere." Duval shifted, then spoke, his voice low. "He wouldn't deal. He thought he could bluff. He stopped, eyes darting toward Margaret. Margaret did not turn to him. Her chin lifted. "I have nothing to say," she murmured. Wolfe's brows lowered. "Silence is your prerogative. It will not alter the facts." Kramer stepped forward, the faint rustle of his coat breaking the stillness. "That's enough for me," he said. His voice was flat, but there was the edge of satisfaction. Wolfe leaned back, reaching for his beer. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, "see the inspector out when he is ready." The coffee's scent lingered, but the room's warmth had shifted. No longer comfort, but the heat of a case closed. Kramer rose from his seat, the weight of decision in his movement. "That's it," he said, gesturing to the uniforms at the door. Duval's shoulders sagged as one officer took his arm. Margaret Lanford stood without prompting, her chin high, though her eyes refused to meet anyone's. The quiet scrape of her chair legs over the carpet carried more sting than any protest might have. Claudia remained seated, hands folded, watching them go. Kramer paused at the threshold. "Mrs. Renwick will face forgery charges," he said, his tone clipped. "But murder? That's not hers to carry." Claudia inclined her head once, accepting the verdict without comment. She was pale, but the set of her jaw spoke of a woman who had made her peace with the lesser weight of her guilt. Wolfe leaned back, exhaling through his nose as the front door shut. The scent of Fritz's coffee still lingered, undisturbed by the sharp scent of rain on wool coats. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, "collect the balance of the retainer from Mrs. Renwick." I crossed to Claudia, who reached for her handbag with deliberate grace. She extracted an envelope, placing it on the desk without a word. I could feel Wolfe's eyes on me as I returned to my chair. He opened the envelope, counted the bills, and replaced them with care. Human folly, he murmured, as though noting the weather. It sustains an unconscionable share of our livelihood. Claudia rose. I will see myself out, she said softly. Her heels clicked against the parquet, measured and unhurried, until the door closed behind her. For a moment, the room held only the tick of the mantel clock and the faint creak of Wolfe's chair as he shifted. He reached for his beer glass. Archie, he said, your return ahead of schedule altered the sequence, but not the destination. I gave him a small nod. He wasn't wrong. Coming back early had changed the way the pieces landed on the board, but the end was always going to look the same. Wolfe turned a page in the dictionary on his desk, as though the evening's exertion had been no more than a mild diversion. That was my cue. I fetched my coat and hat from the rack. The air in the hall carried a cool trace from the outer door, a hint of the night waiting beyond. Outside, the city's damp breath met me full in the face. The street lamps glowed on the wet pavement, their light fractured by small pools where the gutters hadn't cleared. A cab's tyres hissed past, spraying fine mist against the curb. I stood a moment, feeling the chill settle through the fabric of my coat. The case was closed, and the night was mine again. Yet as I started down the block, I knew Wolfe's words would follow me, about folly, inevitability, and the quiet certainty that every path, sooner or later, circles back to the truth. The plant rooms carried their own weather, as always. The glass panes beaded with condensation, and the air wrapped close and heavy, rich with the damp perfume of soil and blossoms. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me, and let the humid warmth replace the February chill still clinging to my coat. Wolfe stood near the east bench, sleeves rolled back, his broad fingers cradling a white cattleya bloom as if it were cut crystal. The pot rested on a clean slate tile, and beside it lay the tools of his trade: shears, a shallow bowl of tepid water, and a cloth folded with military precision. He did not look up immediately. You might have waited until morning, he said at last, his voice even. I could have, I answered, but I thought you'd be here, finishing up the night's real work. He lifted the bloom toward the light, examining a faint ripple on one petal. Timing, Archie, is not the servant men imagine it to be. They speak of seizing moments as if the current of events can be commanded. Yet, it is the current that carries them, and resistance. He paused to pinch away a thread of discoloured root. Resistance only wears them down sooner. I leaned against the work table, careful of the row of tender seedlings at my elbow. The glass roof showed nothing but black beyond its lamps, but I could almost hear the rain outside, softened to a dull whisper by the steam in the air. Your saying tonight was bound to end the way it did, I said. He replaced the pot on its shelf, straightening it to align with the row. I am saying, he replied, that inevitability does not excuse folly. The truth is a plant, Archie. It grows in its own manner, shaped by season, light and care. Tamper with its roots for vanity, or shade it for gain, and you court blight. I watched him cross to the far bench. His gait was unhurried, his attention fixed on a rare Miltonia whose buds had begun to open. The air was thick enough to fog the lenses of my spectacles. I took them off, wiping them with my handkerchief. I suppose, I said, that some people think they can graft their own version of events onto the truth and have it thrive. He gave a faint grunt, selecting a narrow brush to flick a speck from the bloom. Some succeed for a time, but the bloom is false. The structure cannot bear its own weight. I let the silence run for a moment, the room's only sound the steady drip of condensation from a pipe overhead into a clay saucer. My mind went to the streets outside earlier that evening. Lamp glow bent across wet pavement, the cool slap of night air, the knowledge that Duval and Margaret would not see another Manhattan dawn except through bars. Wolfe adjusted the lamp above the Miltonia, then turned toward me. You returned early. That altered the arrangement of facts, but not the fact of arrangement. I smiled. You've mentioned that before. I'm starting to take it personally. You should not. The inevitability was theirs. He moved past me, pausing to lift the lid from a shallow tray of seedlings, checking the moisture with a fingertip. Our part was to observe, to know when to apply the shears. I breathed in the mingled scents, sweet, earthy, faintly medicinal. The warmth was complete now, seeping through my coat and easing the memory of the damp February air that had met me when this business began. Wolfe bent once more over the cattleya, patient, unhurried, and entirely in control.